Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our 2022 Crae annual lecture. My name's Laura Crae, and I'm delighted to be your host for this evening. It's really wonderful to see so many familiar names in the attendees list, and also lots of less familiar names too. So whether this is your first time at a Crae event, whether you have a close connection to us, or whether you're somewhere in the middle, it's really wonderful to have you here with us. For those of you who are less familiar with Crae, and as a refresher to those of you who know us well, Crae is the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, and we're based at University College London in the UK. And Crae comprises a team that includes autistic and non-autistic staff and students. And our goal and our ethos at Crae is to conduct really high quality autism research. But importantly, we aim for that research to be on topics that really matter to autistic people and their allies, and that also make a genuine difference to people's day-to-day lives. We're also really committed to meaningfully involving the autistic and broader autism communities in the work that we do, adopting a really participatory and collaborative approach in our research and in our engagement activities. We're also very keen to ensure that academic research on autism is shared beyond academia, and that everyone can engage with our work and also that of other researchers and advocates in a really engaging and accessible way. And that's one of the reasons that we put this event on every year, to showcase some of the leading autism researchers and advocates in the field to an audience that includes, but also goes beyond academia. And at this point, I'd like to say a particular thank you to all of our funders, supporters, and team members that make these events possible, and particularly to the Pears Foundation, who really generously support our work at Crae, and without whom these events wouldn't be possible. So that's a bit about our centre and our values. And I'm absolutely delighted now to introduce you to our Crae annual lecturer for 2022, the phenomenal Sue Fletcher Watson. Sue is Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Edinburgh, where she's also Director of the Salverson Mindroom Research Centre. But on a more personal note, the reason that we invited Sue to deliver this lecture tonight is quite simply because she's doing some of the most innovative, rigorous, trailblazing and impactful research in the field, but is also doing so in a manner that's really respectful and ethical towards the autistic community. And quite simply, when we talk about and think about allies to the autistic community, to us, Sue is a shining star who so many of us in the field can learn from. And we're delighted that Sue's taken the time to come and speak to us today and to share her work with our Crae community. In terms of how the event will operate, Sue's lecture is due to end at around 7 o'clock, and then we're going to take questions until 7:30 p.m. If you have a question for Sue, you're welcome to post it on Zoom using the Q&A or chat functions. Or if you prefer to post your question anonymously, there's a website called Slido, and the link to the Slido will be going in the chat box shortly. I should say, though, we have had hundreds of people register for the event tonight, and I'm sure that there's going to be lots of questions for Sue that we just won't be able to get through, but we will absolutely try our very best to get through as many as we can, so please do keep them coming throughout the session. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And a huge thank you to Sue for delivering our 2022 Crae annual lecture on neurodiversity-affirmative education for autistic learners. We're really, really looking forward to it. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a really quite overwhelming introduction. You're going to make me cry if you carry on at that rate, which isn't what I'm here to do. Okay, so I've got my slides up and I'm sure that someone will shout at me if there's any problem with them, but I'm hoping that that's fine. So it's an absolute honour to be invited to give this lecture. I'm so impressed by the work that Crae does. They're very kind to refer to me as a kind of role model, but I really you know, Crae is the whole organization and everyone who works there are completely role models to me. And I feel I learn so much from the way they go about doing research and the kinds of questions that they choose to focus on. Right, so without further ado, though, I will get cracking with my annual lecture on neurodiversity-affirmative education for autistic learners. I'm just a couple of links that I think are going to go up in the chat for you. This is a link to a post about my conflicts of interest, if you're interested to know who has funded me and my various kind of responsibilities in the field that may influence my work, then you can read about them there. And this is a link to where I have posted a copy of the slides that I'm using today on Figshare. So if you want to be able to download your own copy and write on them or anything like that, then you can go and find them on Figshare. And as I say, I think those links will go up in the chat if they're not there already. Obviously, I also need to thank a lot of people. I realize this is a very busy slide and I'm not going to go through it all, but it's there so that you can refer to it if you want to follow up on some of the kind of leads that I talk about this evening. So thank you to all of my collaborators, especially the very many people with whom I've had a lot of conversations about neurodiversity in recent years and who have really shaped my thinking and kind of honed the articulation of that idea, which I hope we will benefit from this evening. Particular shout out to two people whose work I will be referring to in a particular way this evening. So Dr. Alyssa Alcorn, who is leading the LEANS project, and Dr. Catherine Crompton, who I'm going to be talking about a couple of her pieces of work this evening. One final thing before I get started on the kind of proper talk is just to use this opportunity to flag up that if you're excited, as I am, about the idea of neurodiversity and interested in thinking about how we can apply that idea in various different settings, in research, in schools, in clinical practice, and so on, then you might be interested in this conference coming up a year from now in March 2023. It's going to be here in Edinburgh, where I'm based, but also available online. It's called Interim, or It Takes All Kinds of Minds, and it's explicitly themed around neurodiversity. And you can find out more about the conference on the website itacom.org. The very first early bird tickets will be going on sale next week. So that's enough salesmanship. Let's get started with what I wanted to talk about this evening. So I'm going to go through thinking about the evidence that suggests that we need new ways of understanding autism or the autistic experience, presenting neurodiversity as one of these alternative ways of thinking about autism and thinking about the ways that the kind of neurotypical built systems could be more supportive of autistic people. I'll directly address some common misunderstandings about neurodiversity that I think limit the potential impact of the idea. I'll give you some ideas of what I think a neurodiversity affirmative school system would look like and a couple of suggestions of how we might get there using research as one of our tools. So for a long time, autism, like other neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories, has been understood in terms of core deficits. And these theories tend to attempt to boil the diversity and complexity of a diagnostic group, such as autistic people, down to some kind of neat, single explanatory route, sometimes at a neurological level or a genetic level, often at a cognitive level. And I think, you know, this is a classic example of looking for your dropped keys under the street lamp because that's where the light is shining and not because that's where you dropped them. In other words, we're bound by the tools that we have as psychologists to seek for psychological explanations. And that has driven a lot of the way that autistic ways of being have been explored in research. So the kind of classic example of a core deficit theory of autism is the theory of mind model, which suggests that autistic people have a specific core deficit in understanding or making predictions about other people's mental states. So what are the problems with these theories? Well, they rest on a couple of assumptions. First is the idea that there is some sort of core element to a diagnostic category like autism. So everyone in that category is similar in some fundamental, perhaps even simple way. And that understanding that kind of core underlying level provides an explanation for what we might observe in our kind of day-to-day interactions. Another kind of central assumption here is that if we can identify this so-called core and we can influence in some way through intervention or structured teaching or something, we can have downstream effects on behavior. So by working with an autistic child, looking at that kind of early social understanding processes, we might influence their language development. So the problem with this assumption is that if the core idea is false, we waste a lot of time, a lot of money pursuing an explanation that's really doomed to fail, because it's all based on this premise that autistic people share some kind of simple, fundamental underlying feature. The other assumption is that the appropriate way to explain the existence of something like autism or the experiences of autistic people is through describing deficits. And this has kind of two components. One is that diagnostic groups are best defined by the things that they find challenging relative to the kind of neurotypical norm. And also just that diagnostic categories represent a sort of deviation from some kind of ideal pathway. And of course, if that's false, then we unnecessarily pathologize the differences between people. We generate and contribute to stigma and the associated negative outcomes that come from that, when of course what we ought to be doing as researchers is fighting stigma and creating more positive outcomes. So are these assumptions false? I think yes, they are. So challenging this idea of the core assumption, this is data from the CALM clinic at Cambridge, and what they have shown, but has been shown in a number of different large neurodiverse samples, is that you can group children by their cognitive profile, you could group children by their neurological profile, brain scan data, and you can also group people according to the clinical diagnostic label that they have. And those groups can be interesting, perhaps scientifically. They may even be useful in different situations. But those groupings don't map onto one another. So in the figure that you can see here, you've got clusters that are bounded by these dotted lines that represent groups of people that are in some way similar to each other, perhaps in a cognitive sense. But you can see that people with different clinical diagnoses are spread across these different clusters. So there isn't a direct mapping between the clinical label and the cognitive profile. And these profiles also don't necessarily predict what's happening in the real world. In other words, how well someone's doing at school. Now, this work was not done by me. This was done by a group of people, as I say, at the University of Cambridge in the Centre for Attention, Learning and Memory. There's a whole wealth of papers that have come out of that group, but I'm just signposting this recent review in JCPP, which is a great kind of gateway to that literature if you want to explore it further. Okay, what about the deficit assumption? Does that one hold up? So we know that autism is defined clinically in our diagnostic manuals by the presence of social and communication deficits. But what we have found in our research is that these so-called deficits disappear during autistic interactions. And we have found this in qualitative reports, the way that autistic people describe their relationships and their social interactions with other autistic people. But we've also quantified it in this paper led by Catherine Crompton. So just to try and describe what we're seeing here on the screen briefly, essentially we had a group where everyone was autistic, that's the green line. We had a group where everyone was non-autistic, that's the red line. And we had a mixed group that included autistic and non-autistic people. And what we asked the groups to do was to pass information down a chain in the form of telling each other a story. And of course, people forget details from the story over time. But crucially, what you can see here is that when everyone in the group is autistic, the rate at which those details are forgotten is almost identical to the rate of forgetting or losing of details in the non-autistic chain. So when everyone is the same neurotype, they share information equally effectively. when you have this mixed group alternating between autistic and non-autistic people, you get this loss of information at a much steeper, faster rate, such that this group gets to the point where they're only remembering maybe 6 or 7 details from the story after just 6 participants, whereas the other chains have another couple of participants before they reach that kind of bottom line. So this is part of a body of work that's being generated across multiple research teams all around the globe. There are a few key authors listed here, but this is really the tip of the iceberg, and I know there's a huge amount of work in progress. And all of this is using a whole range of different methods to really expose the idea that the so-called deficits that have been used to label autism are actually not as immutable as we had thought, and are very kind of contextually bound, specifically appearing when autistic people are interacting with non-autistic people. Just a flag as well for anyone who's going to INSAR, the conference in May that's going to be in Texas this year. There's going to be a wonderful symposium on the double empathy problem, which is the theoretical model created by Damien Milton that inspired a lot of this research. And I'd really recommend going to that if you're going to be at INSAR in person or online. I think it's going to be brilliant. Okay, so we don't like these core deficit models. They don't hold up. But how do we replace them? So I'm not going to go through every single item on this slide, but I think we need to think across the board about what questions we're asking, the methods that we're using to ask those questions, who's leading that research, and what we're doing with the answers. And I'm going to focus particularly here on what questions we're asking, and specifically the application of the neurodiversity paradigm as a way to shift our model of what's a useful way of understanding autistic ways of being. Okay, so let's define neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is the fact that all human beings vary in the way that our brains work. So we vary in how we take in information, how we process it, and of course, therefore, how we respond to it. But beyond this kind of fairly simple and incontrovertible fact, we also have the neurodiversity paradigm. And there are 3 tenets of this paradigm. One is that neurodiversity is naturally occurring. The second is that no way of being is better than another. And the third is that neurodiversity operates in the similar way to other equality and diversity dimensions, other protected characteristics, such as being from a minority ethnic group in a particular society, LGBTQ+ status, some genders, and so on. The sorts of discrimination and prejudice and stigma and resulting challenges that apply to those sorts of minorities also apply to neurominorities. And this articulation of the paradigm is really taken from the work of Nick Walker. I can really recommend her work. It's absolutely fantastic. There's a lot on the website neuroqueer.com, I think. If you search neuroqueer, I think it'll come up, but also in this recent book, which I'm reading at the moment and is absolutely brilliant. I would add a 4th element to the neurodiversity paradigm myself, which is the idea that diversity itself brings strength into a particular scenario, into any classroom, into any community, into any family. And the way that we measure that strength has to be about collective value rather than individual value. And I'll return to that theme a little bit more later on. So a really useful way of understanding neurodiversity can be used to use kind of metaphors from nature, and we found that really useful in the work that we're doing teaching children about neurodiversity. Again, I'll come to that a little bit later on. So if you look at the pictures of trees on this slide, we've got 3 apple trees. We might call them typical, tree typical, or neurotypical. And we've got 3 other more divergent trees, a palm tree, a willow tree, and a cherry tree. So what we see here is evidence for all 4 of those tenets of the neurodiversity paradigm. We see that this variation is naturally occurring. All of these trees are meant to grow exactly as they have done, and we can see group level differences, for example, between apple trees and willow trees, but also individual differences between one apple tree and another. We can also see that all of these trees have equal value. They all serve their own purpose, but part of their value comes from the richness and diversity that lots of different kinds of trees bring to a particular woodland. We can see majority status, so represented here by the apple trees, and minority or divergent status. And you can see how with these trees, their outcome, so how well they grow and flourish, is going to be dictated by the match between what they need and what their environment provides. So the palm tree is going to thrive in dry, sunny weather. The willow tree is going to thrive if it's planted next to the water. And that's not a flaw in the willow tree or a strength in the palm tree. That's just about each tree needing a match with its environment in order to thrive. As I've already said, diversity is a property of the woodland as a whole, just as neurodiversity is a property of the human species as a whole, or of any large enough group of humans. And the strength comes from that rich variation, the unique properties that every tree brings to its environment. So let's just address some common misunderstandings about neurodiversity that I think are important to set to one side before we can carry on. So one that's very common in the education sector is the idea that neurodiversity is just a new word for special educational needs and disabilities, or in Scotland we would say additional support needs, or in Wales I think additional support for learning. In other words, you could just go through your school website and anywhere that it says additional support needs, you could just delete that and type in neurodiversity and bam, you're done. This misunderstanding carries a couple of risks of failing to deliver on the real kind of potential of the concept of neurodiversity. So the first risk is that we just change our language, but we don't really change our actions. And just changing our language is hardly a transformational shift. And worse than that, actually, we might reinforce existing stigma that is attached to neurodivergence by failing to deliver on the inclusive potential of the idea. So if you think about the term special educational needs, that was introduced quite clearly in an effort to combat stigma. The word special only has positive connotations, or only had positive connotations up to that point. But when I was at school, it quickly became a slur. People would talk about other folk as being special in a really dismissive and unpleasant way. And I think that's because it was a term that reinforced this sort of us and them dynamic, right? One of the really powerful things about neurodiversity is that it includes everyone, and it can't really be used to chop people up and to label people as separate, because we all have a neurotype. We all have a matching between our needs and our environment. Sometimes that matching is working well for us and sometimes it's not. But, you know, we're all in the same boat, if you like. So instead of just using neurodiversity as a synonym, what we need to do is use neurodiversity as a tool to rethink how we do things in school and why things are done in a particular way. And just to reinforce this perspective on neurodiversity, I've got a quote here from Judy Singer, who's widely credited with coining the term. And she says, "Neurodiversity is not a classificatory term dividing us from them. We are all neurodiverse. We live on a neurodiverse planet in which amoral nature generates endless genetic diversity, while we humans have evolved the capacity to make judgments about nature's bounty. What neurodiversity brings us is a challenge to find a place for everyone and to distribute the bounty fairly." And I've highlighted those last few words because I think it's such a powerful call to action to find a place for everyone and to distribute the bounty fairly. And I think that's what we should be doing. Okay, second common misunderstanding is that neurodiversity is just a strengths-based process. So there's a few risks here, even though I think probably like everyone, I think it is great to identify someone's strengths. It is great to big up their achievements, to use those talents to help them feel self-esteem, confidence, opportunities for employment in the future. Of course, identifying strengths and working with them is fantastic. But if that's only as far as we go, if neurodiversity stops at the point of identifying and celebrating individual talents, I think there's a few risks. One is that we put additional pressure on neurodivergent students to excel in something, to somehow compensate for being neurodivergent by being also very, very good at maths or art, for example. We also risk using this focus on strengths and talents inadvertently to divide neurodivergent people into more or less valuable categories, so failing the radical impact of the idea, which is fully inclusive. And we also risk emphasizing the individual rather than the collective. And if you just think back to the trees, it's not so much about whether the willow tree is better than the cherry tree or the apple tree is better than the palm tree. It's about the fact that having lots of different kinds of trees in the woodland is a source of strength. And so that's where we need to shift our focus, is onto that kind of collective strength that comes from diversity, and not so much the individual talents that people have, though those are also wonderful things. So instead, neurodiversity reminds us that diversity itself is a strength, and I've been very influenced by the writing of June Meadows on this front, who said, she's talking about an article in Forbes magazine in this quote, and she says, discussing autism, ADHD and dyslexia, this article claims that the term neurodiversity was created to shift the focus from the negative connotation of these conditions towards the positive. A statement that waters the entire concept down into a floppy milquetoast version of its former self. It's not a nice euphemism for autism, and it's about far more than just fighting negative connotations. I really like the righteous anger in this quote. The third common misunderstanding that I wanted to address directly is the idea that the neurodiversity paradigm rejects the concept of disability, so that by emphasizing that people are different from each other and by valuing those differences, the logic goes that we're simultaneously denying that anyone has any kind of support needs. So I think if we choose, what's important to remember is that this is a choice that people are making to say neurodiversity doesn't include disabled people, right? Rather than, the simplest solution to this problem is simply to say, yes, it does, right? Neurodiversity includes everyone. And if I say everyone is valued, I mean everyone is valued. And if when I say everyone is valued, you think, but she can't possibly mean people with an intellectual disability. She can't possibly mean people with really high support needs. No, I do. I mean everyone. So I think if we adopt a version of neurodiversity that excludes certain groups of people, such as people who identify as disabled or people who identify as having a mental illness and who want treatment for that illness, then we risk failing on the inclusive potential and the beneficial potential of the concept of neurodiversity. We also risk denying the support needs that people have. Of course, the purpose of the neurodiversity paradigm is not to withdraw support, far from it. We also risk reinforcing a value system that is a little too capitalist for my liking. So subscribing to this idea that the appropriate way to measure people's worth is by their earning power, or perhaps earlier in life by their school grades. Instead, I think the neurodiversity paradigm fully embraces the concept of disability. The big shift is not in denial of needs, it's in offering support without judgment and without a normalization agenda. So that support is given freely, and it's given with the purpose of enabling that individual to thrive on their own terms, not to become more neurotypical, which is what a lot of autism support has done in the past. So another person who's influenced my thoughts here very greatly is Robert Chapman, and this is a quote from a piece of writing that they published last year, which I really love. They said, "We should not jump to rejecting the very possibility of mental pathology or of a wrong brain. Rather, we must work on allowing more space for individuals and groups to self-define as healthy or ill, different or disordered, perfect or broken, in need of either medical or political intervention or whatever combination of these." So I think Robert there is really pushing the inclusivity of the neurodiversity concept and saying everyone is welcome in this umbrella, whatever their perception of their own needs and the way that they identify and describe those needs or their experience of the world. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Okay, so I'm about halfway through, and look, it's bang on 6:30. Oh, I'm very proud of myself. So I thought I would just give you a few kind of take-home messages as an interim summary before we go into the second part of the talk. So first of all, I talked about the fact that we need new ways of understanding autism. And to justify this, I was discussing the sort of core deficit models that have driven so much of research in autism, and similar kinds of research looking at other neurodevelopmental diagnostic groups as well. These core deficit models rest on two unfounded assumptions. One is the idea that within a diagnostic group, there is some kind of core feature that unites members of that group. And the second is that that group is best understood or characterized in terms of deficits relative to a neurotypical standard. New research, as I've shown, is directly exposing both of those assumptions as false. And so we need a new model for understanding neurodevelopmental diversity. So neurodiversity, and specifically the neurodiversity paradigm, is a great candidate for this. Neurodiversity includes everyone. So in your classroom, in your staff room, in your community, perhaps in your family, you will find neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is naturally occurring and generates collective value, strength in diversity. And neurodiversity also operates much like other dimensions of diversity. So I didn't go into this in a lot of detail, but essentially what I'm talking about there is the way in which divergence from a majority status or a status that is considered the norm in a particular context carries with it social dynamics, things like prejudice, discrimination, stigma, stereotyping, and that drives a lot of the experience of neurodivergent people in the same way that it drives a lot of the experience of other kinds of minorities, such as ethnic minorities. I also talked about some common misunderstandings, and I suppose the two takeaways here is that applying this idea in schools requires a real shift in perspective, not just in language, and that neurodiversity pushes us to recognize people's strengths, but also to accept their unmet needs without judgment and with support. Okay, so let me just have a sip of water before we carry on. So, what would a neurodiversity affirmative school look like? I have got 4 suggestions for you. But first, let me set the scene. I think there'll probably be quite a few educators in the audience. I hope so, and I'm very grateful for you taking the time to come along at the end of a long and busy work day. And I think it's really important to emphasize how much there is to be proud of in our education system in the UK. We have inclusion as a standard model, while also providing specialist environments for people who need greater adaptations than can easily be facilitated in a mainstream school. We have an incredibly dedicated workforce of staff. Their dedication particularly stark given the fact that they're horribly underpaid for the roles that they're doing. Our education system last year was ranked 11th in the world rankings. We have a 99% enrollment rate in our primary schools. In other words, the school system in the UK is reaching nearly every child in the country. And of course, our education system is very highly culturally valued. There's a reason why Tony Blair swept to power in 1997 off the back of his education, education, education pledge. This is something that as a society we really value and we really care about. But there are some tough things about our education system at the moment. It is very poorly under-resourced, not just in terms of the aforementioned staff salaries, but in terms of school resources within schools, but also buildings and other kind of infrastructure. There's huge pressure in the curriculum. There are a lot of targets that teachers are expected to meet, and they are relatively uncompromising. We know that there are systemic inequalities in our school system, such that people from particular socioeconomic backgrounds, particular ethnicities, do not have an equal opportunity to thrive in school. And specifically, we know that there are many poor neurodivergent outcomes. So neurodivergent young people are more likely to be excluded from school. Recent data from our partners at the Salvus and Mindrum Centre, that's a charity partner that our research centre works very closely with, their data recently looking at the Millennium Cohort Study showed that young boys with ADHD particularly were more than 8 times more likely to be excluded from school than the baseline rate in the population. We also know that neurodivergent people participate less in class, they experience poor mental health and low well-being, and they're also more likely to be bullied or victimized by their peers. So there's definitely some tough stuff going on as well, despite all of the goodwill and the skill that's present in our schools. So where do we want to be? What does our neurodiversity affirmative school system look like? First of all, a neurodiversity affirmative school system will expect diversity. So at the moment, we have a sense of an increasing frequency and range of needs, but it's very much framed around the idea of diversity, or perhaps I should say divergence, as the exception, not the rule. People seem sort of surprised by the number of neurodivergent young people in a classroom. This results in requests for kind of specialist training or extra resources, and creates a challenge because schools, as I've said, have enormous pressure to meet curriculum targets at the moment. So where do we want to be? I think we want to have a system where individualized learning is baked into education. So the curriculum is designed in such a way as to be flexible and to be built around an expectation of diversity in learning profiles within the classroom. And a key way to achieve that is going to be through systemic change and investment in schools. But what could we do more immediately? So I think one thing is to draw on the expertise of neurodivergent educators and learners themselves. And I just have a logo up here for the Autistic School Staff Project. This is being led by Dr. Becky Wood with a lot of collaborators. And it's a really great example of a piece of work that in this case is aiming to harness and understand the experience of autistic educators, though I think more broadly neurodivergent educators have a really important role to play in our schools. I think we also need to create an environment where there's a degree of openness and dialogue around conflicting needs. One of the most challenging things about neurodiversity in the classroom is the fact that the things that 2 different pupils need may be completely opposite to each other. You know, one pupil may need to be able to stand up and fidget and move around, and another may need real kind of stillness and quiet in order to be able to concentrate. Some of those things are pretty intractable to resolve, but we're definitely not going to get closer to resolving them if we can't even have open conversations about them. I also think that we could be doing more in classrooms to celebrate diversity itself. So rather than thinking about who's written the best poem or drawn the best picture, thinking about the sheer variety of ways that children might choose to go about completing a task that you've set them. Look at all these different poems, look at all these different pictures. Another feature of a neurodiversity affirmative school for me is something that would be much more focused on a child-centered rather than a diagnosis-centered process. So at the moment, despite the fact that the legal frameworks are often in place to allow support to be offered before a clinical diagnosis is given, the reality is that support is often linked to a specific diagnosis. This disempowers teachers who feel, I think, that they have to wait for a clinical decision sometimes before taking action. And we also know that diagnostic gatekeeping is a problem because diagnosis is not equally available to everyone. So we know that factors like socioeconomic deprivation, like ethnicity, like gender, shift the likelihood that an individual will get a particular diagnosis. I just want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by this pathway or this diagnostic gatekeeping. So this is based on a kind of case study, a family that I spoke to recently. Imagine this young girl, Scarlett. She's clearly bright, but she fidgets and she has trouble concentrating in class. After a dialogue with her parents and Scarlett herself, the teachers decide that they should refer Scarlett for a diagnostic assessment. Scarlett sits on the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services waiting list for 1.5 years and is finally assessed for ADHD. But because she's a girl, she doesn't actually get the diagnosis. The clinician thinks that her profile is atypical. She's not sure that she meets the diagnostic criteria. Scarlett waits another 12 months to get a second opinion, finally gets her ADHD diagnosis confirmed, and starts to get some help at school off the back of that. And that whole process takes in the region of 3 years. There's an alternative pathway where Scarlett's teacher notices that Scarlett is bright but fidgets and has trouble concentrating in class, and gives Scarlett a fidget toy, a wobble cushion to sit on, and lets her take movement breaks during lessons when she needs to. Now, this is a simplistic example, obviously, and I realise that many cases will not fall out in such a neat way, but I do think there is a pattern here where teachers and parents are heading down the kind of clinical branch line because of a belief in the need for, or the value or the importance of a diagnostic label in order to act as some kind of key to unlock supports and understanding. And there is maybe a more immediate pathway that is being forgotten about, or that people don't feel empowered to walk down because they think they need to wait for the CAMHS decision to come back before they can take action. Okay, so where do we want to be in the future? I think we want to have a system where individualized profiling is mapped straight on to school supports. So instead of going down this diagnostic branch line, or at least in parallel with going down that clinical pathway, there is a more immediate mapping that says, I've identified that this young person is struggling in some way. We know that's always the case, because otherwise how would they get onto the clinical pathway? So we know that there's something going on here. Let's do some analysis of what that problem is in a sort of immediate hands-on way, and think about what supports we can offer to that individual, regardless of what the outcome of the clinical process might be. And of course, in common with everything I'm going to suggest this evening, we need some systemic change and investment in schools to deliver this outcome. But what can we do in the meantime? Remember, I think that not everyone who needs support has a diagnosis. I think that's a really essential point that should be at the forefront of our minds, given the unequal access to diagnosis that exists. Think about making good use of the adjustments that everyone can access. Things like movement breaks don't cost anything, but also if you're creating a visual timetable for one student in the class, or a written copy of the instructions, there's nothing stopping us from making that available to every student who wants it. So think about whether it's really necessary to limit access to these things where those resources are available. And finally, be confident in your skills, your knowledge about the children in your classroom as an educator. And I've just flagged up here the logo for a wonderful piece of work led by Dr. Natasha Pantich here at the University of Edinburgh. If you Google Team for Change, I think it'll come up. And what she's been working on is a project looking at teachers as agents of change, empowering teachers to identify and make changes within schools and be at the forefront of that development. Okay, so the third aspect of a neurodiversity affirmative school would be focused on developing self-advocacy skills. So at the moment, young people often lack the capacity to articulate what their needs might be, or lack an invitation to do so. School environments emphasize teacher authority very often, not always. And I should maybe just take a moment to say that I think everything I'm saying is based on a certain degree of generic averaging across schools, and I'm well aware of the exceptional beacons of good practice in individual schools and individual classrooms all over the country. Another factor that I think limits our capacity to encourage self-advocacy is the fact that resources are often controlled because they're expensive. And that makes it very difficult to say to young people, you can just ask for what you need, because the possible outcome is that they could ask for what they need and you still can't provide it. So that's one reason why we need systemic change and investment in schools. But I think we should also explicitly teach self-advocacy skills to young people, and that has to be partnered with a culture of believing them when they say, this is difficult for me and I'm going to need some extra help. I think in the short term, we can think about emphasizing the universality of needs in our classroom. And the concept of met versus unmet needs is really helpful here. So the idea that everyone needs things to enable them to learn. Some of those needs are met by standard provision in the classroom, standard pedagogy, standard resources, and other needs are not met by the things that are there as standard. And so people need to identify those needs and identify the appropriate ways of meeting them. We need to create an environment where it is okay to ask for help and it is okay to receive it, and really kind of tackle any shame that people feel around those things. And that links me directly, oh, no, sorry, before I go on, I just wanted to flag a project that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail just towards the end of this lecture, which is a piece of work looking at peer support in secondary schools that has been led again by Catherine Crompton along with her collaborators, and contains a major component of supporting young people's self-advocacy skills. And I'll return to that in a moment. But in terms of creating that environment where it's okay to ask for help, I think the final aspect of a neurodiversity affirmative school is a school with an anti-stigma agenda. So as I said in the first half of the talk, we know that neurodiversity operates in a similar way to other equality and diversity dimensions. We know that neurodivergence carries a degree of widespread stigma, and we know that this stigma leads to things like masking, feeling shame, feeling fear at the possibility of being diagnosed or of having your diagnostic status revealed. In the future, as well as, here we go again, systemic change and investment in schools, I think we should be looking to create an anti-stigma environment in the classroom and a rights-based approach to learning. And I just wanted to flag some work that's being done here in Edinburgh by colleagues of mine, Dr. Bérangère Digard and Dr. Rachel Davis, looking at access to bilingualism for autistic people. And they've very much taken a rights-based approach to understanding this topic. So while as a psychologist I am fascinated to know whether being raised in a bilingual household influences a child's working memory or social interactive profile, there's a more fundamental principle at stake here, which is that autistic children in bilingual households or bilingual countries, or just with an interest in language learning, have a right to be able to access those languages. In terms of more immediate opportunities in the classroom for creating an anti-stigma environment, I think it's worth thinking about reading material with neurodivergent characters. I shouldn't have to say this, and I hope, I'm sure for people in the Crae audience, I don't need to say this, but it is disappointing still how often when a neurodivergent young person is bullied, perhaps especially when an autistic young person is bullied, the solution that is offered is ways for that autistic young person to change to avoid being bullied in the future. We obviously need a culture in our schools where the bully and not the bullied is asked to change. And I think creating peer support opportunities is really important in our schools for neurodivergent young people, creating spaces where people can be together and can feel that they are among folk like them. So just to kind of link those features of a neurodiversity affirmative school back to the tenets of the neurodiversity paradigm, we know that neurodiversity is naturally occurring, and so we need to have a school system that expects diversity. We know that there's no one way of being that is better than another, and so we need to have a system that profiles each individual where they are and as they are, rather than being focused on giving people a label and using that as a proxy for understanding the individual person. We know that neurodiversity operates in much the same way as other equality and diversity dimensions. And so just like the skills that Black young people need or LGBTQ+ young people need to advocate for themselves, to stand up to the racism or homophobia or transphobia that they might encounter, we need to make sure that our neurodivergent young people have a toolkit to self-advocate and to resist those prejudices. And we need to create an environment that fights stigma and does so by recognizing the strength that diversity brings to our communities and to our schools specifically. Okay, so how do we get there? Just in the last 5 to 10 minutes, I'm just going to give you a couple examples of research projects that we've been working on that I think are part of how we might get from here to there. So the first one is the LEANS project, and some of you might have heard about this before if you've been to a Crae seminar in December led by my colleague Dr. Alyssa Alcorn. So learning about neurodiversity at school, or LEANS, is a project that directly addresses the environment that is created by other people in the classroom, specifically other pupils, though to some extent teachers as well. And the goal with this project was to create a resource that would allow teachers in primary schools to teach about neurodiversity, the concept of neurodiversity, as I've been discussing it this evening, to the whole class. So it's very distinctive from the model of a lot of support that's given to neurodivergent young people, which is about identifying that young person, separating them, and offering this kind of individualized support. This is about upskilling the whole class to understand neurodiversity, to understand each other more effectively. What we've done over the course of this project is co-design a detailed resource pack for teaching about neurodiversity. So the resource pack includes a handbook, which is essentially a training course in a book. The idea is that any teacher would be able to download the pack, and if they follow the steps closely, then they would be able to deliver it without needing to go on a training course. There are detailed lesson plans, guidelines, materials for printing out and giving to pupils. Alyssa has written a whole volume of stories about a fictional classroom, which provides a really important way to make some of the concepts about neurodiversity much more concrete for young people, without asking young people in the classroom themselves to share their own experience of being neurodivergent. And there are also classroom posters to summarize some of the key points in each of the 7 units. Everything has been co-designed with a neurodiverse team. We've been through rounds of consultation, evaluation, and professional design of the final resource, including these lovely illustrations by Claire Hubbard, which are just absolutely gorgeous. The evaluation is just finished. We evaluated it in 8 classrooms across 4 schools in Scotland, with a focus on feasibility. Could teachers deliver it as we had laid out? Would they get to the end of the programme? Would all the kids pay attention? And also, to a slightly lesser extent, on outcome. Did children learn something? Did they have a good experience? There was also a really strong focus on risk of harm. So if you're going to bring up the topic of neurodiversity in the whole class, that you've got to pay attention to the fact that neurodivergent children in that class could feel exposed, they could be put at risk in various ways. And so we've designed the pack very, very carefully to avoid those sorts of harms. And we also did some interviews with pupils with a particular focus on neurodivergent pupils who'd done LEANS to find out if they enjoyed it. And I'm happy to report that they liked it very, very much, but also of real interest. They clearly didn't think it was that different to the other things that they learnt in schools, which I think is a real strength. You know, there wasn't a sense of doing something risky or dangerous or weird, and that's great. So the goals of LEANS are to change the knowledge that people have about neurodiversity, but also what they think about each other, about neurodivergent people, perhaps what they think about themselves, and also what they do, their intended actions. So the ways in which they might intend to behave in the classroom in the future. And that learning is organized into key points. Here's an example of one of the key points. How I choose to treat other people in class can make a big difference to how they feel and how their school day goes. So as you can see, this is really directly focused on the idea that a big part of a neurodivergent person's school experience is how other people behave to them. And I picked this key point out because in the evaluation, one of the really nice details of our results was that lots and lots of young people, when they were asked directly about this at baseline, answered this question by saying, I don't know. I don't know if how I choose to treat other people in class makes a difference to them. But by the end of the study, no one was unsure about that. No one said, I don't know. They all had a really clear sense that their behaviour impacted other people in the classroom. I'm not going to tell you any more about the evaluation, by the way. As I said, this is work that's led by Dr. Alyssa Alcorn, and it's for her to share the results when they're ready. But we do think that teaching about neurodiversity is really important. It provides a way to reflect on the diversity of experiences within the classroom. It provides people with alternative narratives that don't carry a lot of stigma about why school can be hard. And one of the ways it does that is by normalizing the concept of needs and the idea that some needs are met and some needs are unmet. It also gives non-arbitrary answers to children's questions. If children are asking, you know, that's not fair, how come he gets to write his report on a laptop and I have to write it out? Or how come she gets to have a fidget spinner in class, or whatever? Those questions can be quite hard for teachers to field, and LEANS gives you a vocabulary and a structure for answering those questions. Another key aspect of LEANS is to reinforce the idea that, you know, you're not entitled to know about other people's needs and you are not required to share your own. So people do not owe their classmates an explanation of why they're having a bit longer in the test, or they didn't have to go to PE today, or whatever. So while I'm not telling you any results, I am telling you that we are going to be launching LEANS on the 14th of June. So we're going to have an online launch event for educators. Please do spread the word. We really want lots of people to come along. It'll be an opportunity to understand the resource in detail, see some excerpts from the resource, hear about the results of our evaluation. You'll hear directly from some of the co-designers and teachers who were involved. You'll be taken through a process of thinking about whether LEANS is right for your school. It won't be right for every school, and how to get it and how to use it. As I say, it is a completely free resource, so you don't need to be at the launch in order to use it. And if you want to sign up for that event, which just went live this morning, you can go to our Eventbrite page. So if you go onto Eventbrite and search for Salverson Research, you should find this event, and we'll also be tweeting about it very heavily over the next few weeks, I have no doubt. Just before I finish and say you a little bit more, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone involved in the LEANS project. It has been such a big part of what we've been doing recently, and as you can imagine, it was very much a team effort. And I'll also just flag that if you are curious to hear more, you can still join the LEANS mailing list by emailing leans@ed.ac.uk. Right, one second research project that I just wanted to flag, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to give you a teensy bit more detail, is the Neurodiversity Alliance. So this is another stepping stone towards neurodiversity-affirmative schools. This one's being led by Catherine Crompton. So historically, peer support models for autistic people have focused on kind of normalizing buddy schemes. And we think it's possible to do better, to bring neurodivergent pupils, autistic and other kinds of neurodivergent pupils together to facilitate a more positive outlook on their identity, a sense of belonging, and to cultivate self-advocacy skills. And there's already been done some preliminary work looking at what autistic people think would make for a really positive peer support model in secondary schools. We're now just to start, well, Catherine is now just about to start the project for earnest. There's going to be a co-design phase and then trialing of the model in 3 schools. And it's very much inspired by other kind of peer support models, such as existing provision for LGBTQ+ youth. And we hope that we will see an impact on things like educational engagement, inclusion, and well-being as a result. Okay, so my final take-home messages. I asked what would neurodiversity affirmative schools look like, and the answer to that, I think, is that they would expect diversity, profile individuals and not clinical labels, actively teach self-advocacy skills, and fight stigma. And how do we get them? I think we need to do collaborative, co-produced research to create and evaluate new resources. But I also think we need to join forces to campaign for systemic change. this is my final slide. This is just some follow-up info. You don't need to write it all down. You can go and get the slides off Figshare, and I'll post this on Twitter as well at the end of the talk. That's my Twitter handle, @SueReviews, if you want to find me on there. And I think that is where I will finish. And thank you all for your attention and for your generosity in coming and spending an hour with me this evening. And I think we'll have questions now.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Sue, for not only a brilliant lecture, but perfectly to time as well. We shall invite you again in future. Honestly, it was just brilliant. And I'm really glad we recorded it as well, because I think it's the kind of talk that every single person who works in a school just has, you know, they've got to hear those messages. I think there's a lot of autism researchers as well who would really benefit from those messages too. And you can see the messages going in the chat there, just saying what a fantastic talk. So thank you so, so much. We do have lots of questions coming. If anyone has any questions they'd like to pose to Sue, you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat box, and the wonderful Crae team are helping to transfer them over into one place for me. So thank you very much for that. We've had a really brilliant question that's come in, going back to something that you spoke about at the start of your lecture around the core deficit theories. And the question is that these kind of theories have been backed up by research for many, many years. They're really, you know, their knowledge about them is widespread. The question is, how do you plan, or how do you think we might start debunking decades worth of the information that's out there so that we can move towards the positive change that you outlined in your lecture?
Oof, that's a great question. Thank you very much for asking. Well, I think that, I think there's a couple of things. So one is that it's important to draw attention to the fact that the methods that we use to sort of test the predictions of those theories were really only ever designed to expose differences between groups, often a neurotypical group and say an autistic group or a group with ADHD or something, and that any differences that were found were sort of default interpreted as showing a deficit on the part of the non-neurotypical participant group, right? So one way to undermine them, these decades of research, is simply to point out that actually methodologically they're pretty weak. A lot of them are also very small samples, very selective samples, lots of kind of restrictive criteria placed on recruitment, so that you're not necessarily getting a picture of what, you know, autistic kids in a particular age bracket are like, because you're maybe excluding everyone who has another diagnosis as well as autism, or you're excluding everyone who is non-speaking, or you're excluding everyone who has a mental health condition, you know. So I think that's one thing, is to kind of critique those methods, and in that way, you know, draw attention to the weaknesses of the literature. I think the other thing is kind of open science, you know, pursuing better methods, not just in the sense of methods that actually have the capacity to understand variability within a group and between groups, but also methods that are transparent. So where you commit to a particular kind of analysis before you have your data, where you publish your data so other people can look at it and check what you did. And I think that means that sort of process can really accelerate the power of research to make change, because it gives us a research basis that's really transparent and really trustworthy. And that's probably an important part of moving forward too.
Brilliant. And I guess if people want to read a bit more as well about your views and some of the kind of methodology underpinning those theories, you can also plug your book with Frankie, which, if the audience hasn't read it, have you got a copy there?
No, I don't. Maybe. I've got the hardback. Which isn't as pretty.
Oh, well, have a look on, it's available in all good bookshops, and it's a really, really brilliant overview of those core deficit theories and actually how we're kind of moving away from them. That's also the thing I love about it in particular, is how you've got autistic perspectives throughout as well, which I think is essential. One question that's come in, another really, really good question. So when you were kind of setting out your vision, you spoke about profiling the individual and not the label. And this person's commented that individualizing profiles may be harder for those who aren't just autistic. So do you have any advice or suggestions for teachers or carers of those who are autistic with, additional neurodevelopmental diagnoses, for example, or other forms of high support need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think this idea of individual profiling is actually a big advantage for people with kind of multiple diagnoses or multiple things going on that may or may not be diagnosed, because if you think about what we use to make a diagnosis, we're sort of obsessed with the things that most clearly distinguish, say, an autistic from a non-autistic person. So a good example of that is eye contact. Eye contact, whether you make eye contact in particular kinds of situations, is a really useful marker for making a clinical diagnosis. It's completely irrelevant when you're thinking about what someone might need in the classroom, except to the extent that all of us neurotypical people need to just get over ourselves and stop being obsessed with whether someone else is making eye contact with us or not. So instead, I think the sort of individualized profiling I'm talking about would focus on things like, how's your working memory? How are you at focusing on tasks for a long period of time or switching between tasks? What's your sensory needs like? How are you finding the sensory environment in the classroom? And could we identify any adaptations from that? And so by shifting the focus away from the features that are important for making an accurate differential clinical diagnosis onto the things that are impacting daily life, I think we escape some of the limitations of the kind of diagnostic process. And I think that's potentially particularly beneficial for people who have multiple diagnoses or high support needs, because in a way this diagnosis is just a sort of branch line. It doesn't actually, if you're here, I've got some problems, I'm not getting the most out of school, and you want to get to here, I'm getting the most out of school, I'm enjoying school, I'm thriving at school. The go and get your clinical diagnosis is just a branch line, and then you have to get back on the main track in order to work out what supports might be useful. So why not just stay on the main track the whole time, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think particularly in schools, although there is a move towards moving towards looking at need rather than label, there is sometimes a little bit of a fixation on that label. And we've had a question that's come in reflecting on the proposed modification of DSM-5 and how that has proposed making the diagnostic criteria for autism a bit more conservative. And they've asked if you have any views on that.
Well, so I don't like calls for more conservative diagnostic criteria or more subgroups, which is the other one that you get quite a lot of, that are based on the idea that what you see a little bit among researchers at the moment is all these autistic people don't fit into my theory, so let's make them not autistic anymore to fit my theory better. So I'm not a fan of that, I have to say. I think essentially quibbling over the diagnostic criteria, whether they should be broader or narrower, it's just sort of, so Nick Walker has this whole thing, which I think is actually originally from a Maya Angelou speech, which is that you can't use the master's tools to destroy the master's house, or something like that. I've butchered the quote. I think looking to diagnostic categories to help us deliver a neurodiversity affirmative education system or any other kind of system, mental health care system, physical healthcare system, employment system, etc., is a classic example of using the master's tools. You're never going to be able to destroy the master's house with the master's tools, right? We need to build our own tool set. And I don't think our tool set necessarily involves the DSM-5 at all, whatever it says in it. I'd be a big fan of self-identification, of looking at needs in a more immediate sense that maps more closely onto the stage of life that you're at and what you want to be doing at that stage of your life, whether that's learning at school or going to university or getting your first job or moving away from home into a residential care setting, you know, whatever stage of life you're at, that sort of profiling around what it is you're wanting to do right now. That's, I think, the model that we need.
And we've had a question that's come in, kind of comment on the converse in terms of to what extent is it fair to claim that actually we're all neurodivergent?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I think there's a really interesting question about whether the category of neurotypical exists, right? And if it does exist, whether typical, meaning, I guess, most people, whether that's a legitimate component of it, you know, because if we added up all the neurodivergent people in the world, especially if we're including people with kind of psychiatric diagnoses, you know, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc., then I think they may well add up to more than half the population, right? Which makes neurotypical a neurominority. I often describe myself as neurotypical, and what I mean when I say that is that I have tended to find it very easy to thrive in the system. I had a good time at school. I found schoolwork relatively straightforward. I found exams fine. I had a decent time at university. You know, my career has been very kind of straightforward, and I'm very rarely in a situation where I feel that the capabilities I have available to me are just not fit for purpose. I'm just being asked to do something that's well outside of my capabilities. There are tons of things that are well outside my capabilities, but I'm not asked to do them because the system, I think, was built probably by people quite like me, for people quite like me. And I guess that's what I mean when I say I'm neurotypical. So, oh, someone's written neurocomfortable in the chat. Yeah, perfect. So I suppose in that sense, I think the label neurotypical is a useful label. I'm not sure that it's literally true, but I think it is a helpful way of designating kind of neuroprivilege, if you like.
Yeah, my wonderful autistic colleague and collaborator Caroline Hurst always says to me that I have to identify as neurotypical because no one has given me my formal diagnosis. So
yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned in that answer as well is about what happens as someone kind of leaves the education system. And a question that's come in and has said that, you know, it's really, really great to see that there's increase in support in schools, but actually what happens when that young person leaves the education system and that kind of support's no longer available to them? So you spoke a lot about let's, you know, encourage young people in schools. I presume that, and sorry, don't mean to answer the question for you, but that this would be a good foundation for young people as they move into adulthood.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's some really important work in schools because, you know, it's such a seminal time in our lives, and we lay down so many patterns and so many ways of understanding ourselves in our childhood and in our adolescence, and that we need to make that as positive experience for as many young people as we possibly can, because that's going to be the sort of resourcefulness and self-knowledge that they'll be drawing on as they get older and start to encounter new challenges in their life around, you know, moving away from home and, you know, perhaps forging kind of lasting romantic relationships and looking for employment, or, you know, whether that's paid or otherwise, and so on. So I think school is very important in terms of its legacy. In terms of post-school, I mean, I think it very much depends, of course, which pathway you're on. So if we think about some autistic people who are perhaps going into higher education or into the world of work, I think higher education particularly essentially needs to be adopting a neurodiversity affirmative model that's pretty much the same as any other learning setting. I think employment is actually, well, I know that lots of autistic people have not had a great experience in employment, but at least theoretically, there's more room there for a kind of neurodiversity affirmative environment than there is in school, because employers are really, really interested in getting the best out of their employees. There's much more of a sense of achievement being based on a collective achievement. You know, you're all contributing your bit to creating this product or this service or whatever. And so there's much less of a sense, you know, in school you're individually graded, you're getting your individual report, your individual exam results, your individual scores on a test. But in the world of work, there's much more of a sense that everyone brings different things to the team. And so there seems to be an opportunity there to apply some neurodiversity principles that could be a little bit more straightforward than we might find in the school system. For young people who are not moving on into further education and who are perhaps going to be living at home, perhaps looking for some supported living options or residential living options, who might be looking for supported employment or working in a kind of collective, I think that the key thing there is just the kind of the horrible cliff that you fall off at the age of sort of 18 or 19, and the complete lack of provision. And I think that there's also a lot of poor quality provision that sort of flows into that space, because there's massive economic pressures to deliver support for people with high support needs that's cheap. And of course, cheap support is very rarely good quality support, regardless of the motivations and the skills of the people involved. But again, similar to what I said about the workplace, you know, theoretically, social care settings, whether that's kind of community drop-in settings, you know, kind of collaborative, creative and making environments. I can't really think, you know, but when you have a group of people who are all, you know, maybe working on a farm and selling the farm produce, or creating kind of artistic outputs and so on and selling those, I think those settings should be more amenable for similar reasons to what I described in the workplace. But we just need to get the message out to them, I think, and explain what that looks like for that kind of setting.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a question that maybe kind of links to what you were just talking about there, which is about how you would engage teachers who are hard to engage, or feel that they don't need to engage, or say they don't have time to address this. And I guess the same would apply to the workplace too. Do you have any thoughts about that? How do we get this message? How do we enact change?
It's difficult. It's difficult because a lot of what I was trying to talk about today was sort of about teacher empowerment, this idea that teachers, who I think can sometimes feel like, oh my goodness, where did all these neurodivergent kids in my class come from? You know, I've got 2 kids with an autism diagnosis this year, and 1 with ADHD and 1 with dyslexia, you know, that sort of feeling of being overwhelmed. And I do really want teachers to feel empowered and confident in the skill set that they have. But the downside of that is, of course, I mean, it's like Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. You can't just say to someone, don't worry, you can just do stuff, you can just act, you can take action, you have power, because that's also really scary. You know, how am I supposed to know what such and such needs in the classroom? What if I offer something and it backfires? You know, what if I don't know, what if I let such and such type all of his work on a laptop, and then he never learns to handwrite properly? Am I dooming him to a future where he can't write a shopping list? You know, so I think it is scary, and I think that's partly where, you know, lots of teachers do request sort of training. I think one of the biggest pieces of work we need to do is around saying, actually, training, especially training linked to particular diagnostic groups, is not the way forward. You know, I've done my autism course, I've done my ADHD course. I think that this is one of the advantages of the neurodiversity paradigm, is that it allows us to talk about the unmet needs that people have in a way that's not kind of, you don't have to then go on multiple courses, one for each diagnostic group that you might encounter through your teaching career. So yeah, but I suppose this also comes back to you know, what I said a few times about sort of systemic change. You know, ultimately, teachers do not have spare capacity or resourcing. They are underpaid for what they contribute to our society. And until we shift the system, or without shifting the system in parallel, I can't imagine how we could ever expect teachers to invest in the kinds of recommendations I've been making, because it's going to be hard work, and people are barely keeping it together sometimes, I think. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think it does, and I think it answers the next question I was going to put to you as well, which was around how neurodiversity incorporates so many different diagnoses. Do you think that's part of the problem or the solution? And I guess you've touched upon that really nicely. I mean, we often hear in education, what works for autistic learners works for everybody. And I guess essentially that's kind of what we're getting at here in terms of neurodiversity as well. I don't know if you had any more thoughts you wanted to share in relation to that, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think my daughter won't mind my telling this story. So my daughter's autistic, and when she was very young, my husband and I, you know, saw that she was not having a great time at school. She was in her first year at school, and you know, we were having a lot of kind of conflicts at home anytime we needed to leave the house and go anywhere, and you know, that kind of thing. And I remember saying to my husband, I think we should just start treating her as if she was autistic and see if that helps, which in retrospect was the first clue that she was indeed autistic. But we just sort of went straight into doing various things, like, you know, if we were going somewhere new, we would just go and look at some photos of it and talk about, you know, the routine and how we were going to get there and what it would be like and how long we would be there and when we would leave and that kind of thing. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is that I suppose that, you know, one of the ways I think that we can escape the sort of being beholden to diagnostic categories is to remind ourselves that actually there's a lot of stuff you can do that isn't going to do any harm, and in the process of doing it you're going to learn a huge amount. So as you say, Laura, if you're making adaptations for autistic pupils in your class, make those adaptations available to everyone, and the people who benefit from them will benefit from them, and the people who could take or leave them will just take or leave them. So, you know, there's a degree of sort of bravery in giving things a go and learning from that experience and sort of sharing things out. You know, I think the visual timetables example is a good one, actually. If you're making a visual timetable for someone in the classroom, just pin it up for everyone to see, you know, and that simultaneously reduces stigma for the individual who really does need it and for whom it was originally made, but also massively increases accessibility because it's there for everyone who wants to see it, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's those kind of strategies that, you know, we need to be promoting more. And I think there's been a lot of interest in your resources as well from the Leans project. So one of our questions, we've got a series of questions about Leans, but first of all, is it possible to access the Leans resources? So presumably you've got the event on the 14th. Is that when the launch is?
Yes, that is the launch. So they will not be available until then. The reason for that is that we've just recently completed the evaluation. We got a lot of qualitative feedback from pupils and from teachers, and we've been making kind of final adjustments to the resources in line with that feedback. So the evaluation wasn't just, does Leans work? It's also, you know, how can we make it better before it's launched? So that's what Alyssa's been working on. She's this very week. And then the next phase will be having all the professional design work done. So the entire pack is going to a graphic designer to be, so we have all the lovely illustrations, some of which I showed you on my slide, but it's also going to a graphic designer so that, you know, this massive handbook, I mean, it's a couple of 100 pages, is going to be as easy as possible to navigate. It'll be straightforward for teachers to see the different kinds of information that they're looking for on each page and so on. And then we need to build the online kind of home for it and make sure that everyone is able to access what they need. And so that's what we're doing over the next few months before the launch. And then we will have the launch and you will be able to plan to deliver Leans next academic year if that's what you would like to do.
Amazing. And we do have our Crae webinar with Alyssa as well that's available on our YouTube channel. So if people want to find out more, you can go back and watch that as well. And actually, we've had a couple of questions come in about the practicalities of Leans as well. And, you know, I'm sure everything will be discussed at the event on the 14th of June, but we've had a question around the age group that Leans is directed at. And the question is specifically in relation to the fact that if this could start as early as possible, it would be amazing. But also a question about who can deliver it. Is it something that kind of speech and language pathologists and other professionals other than just the teacher can deliver as well? So I don't know if you want to direct everyone to the webinar or address the questions.
No, I'm happy to address those questions. They're definitely things we've talked about, so I feel I know the answers. So on the first question, age range, so we've designed it for 8 to 11-year-olds. So in Scotland, that would be P5, P6 and P7. I'm not sure what the year groups are in England, sorry, but the kind of upper end of primary school, essentially. We are really interested, Alyssa particularly is really interested in developing a version of Leans for the very beginning of primary school, but that's not a project that we have funded just yet. If there's any billionaires listening who would like to get in touch, please do. So that's the age range of the children. Who can deliver it? So we would strongly advise that it's delivered by a group of children's regular classroom teacher. And one of the key reasons for that is that, as I said, you know, we're really aware of the possibility of kind of risk of harms around raising a topic that is associated with a lot of stigma. Leans is very much a kind of anti-stigma program. It's really trying to make people feel that having needs in the classroom is normal and fine, and you can ask for help and it's okay, and we shouldn't be judging each other and so on and so forth. But the fact is there's a huge amount of stigma there. And so if you're going to start having conversations in your classroom, just as if you were going to do some anti-racism work in your classroom, for example, we really want the person to be leading those discussions, to be the person who knows that class best, and also will be with them on their journey after Leans, because, you know, we're expecting Leans to start off a conversation that is going to be long lasting and that is going to have, you know, going to be something that teachers sort of return to with their pupils in the future and refer to as kind of challenges rise up in the classroom. And so we really feel that the regular classroom teacher is the right person to go on that journey with their class.
We've had a really, really brilliant question come in that I think links to what you were talking about. And it's really asking about what the role of parents needs to be as we're introducing children and young people to the idea of neurodiversity, and in terms of children really, you know, understanding and taking on board these neurodiversity affirmative policies. Is that something that Leans is considering?
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot. One of the reasons why we thought that doing a program like Leans in primary school would be really powerful is because certainly my experience as a parent, maybe yours as well, Laura, has been that I've learned an awful lot from my kids trotting back from primary school and telling me about, you know, the life cycle of such and such toad or whatever it is, you know, or the poor turtles in the sea who have been eating plastic and, you know, etc., etc. So I think we felt that by reaching pupils, we had the potential to spread a neurodiversity message beyond the school as well, out into families. Definitely think that some of the stigma and fear and kind of stereotypes that young people hold come from their families, and there is definitely room to try and reach parents. But the challenge there is that, unlike school children, there's no place where you can get at a whole kind of generation of parents in a collective way. So so that's why we decided to focus our attention on the kids. We are really interested in a possible version of Leans that might be focusing on sort of the family unit as a kind of post-diagnostic support tool, or perhaps not post-diagnostic, but post, oh, I've spotted something's going on here. So a way for families to understand neurodiversity within their family unit. But it's really hard to say at this stage what that sort of thing would look like. But I do think the principle that educating people about the idea of neurodiversity is a really powerful tool for shifting a lot of the ways that we currently understand what it is to be autistic, what it is to have ADHD, what it is to be dyslexic. And that's definitely something that we would like to see happening across a range of settings and with a range of different kinds of audiences.
Absolutely. The time has flown by and it's 7:30, which means that we've come to the close of this evening's session. I'm really, really sorry to everyone whose question we haven't been able to put to Sue. But just to say a huge thank you, Sue, for such a brilliant annual lecture. It's just such an amazing example of really kind of high quality, theory-driven, empirically innovative research, and how that can really positively impact educational practice for autistic learners. It's just incredible. I'm in awe of everything you and your team are doing. It's phenomenal. As we close the event today, I just want to say a huge thank you to the Crae team for all of your support behind the scenes, and a very, very special thank you to Maria and Mel in particular, who've been the most amazing source of support. On behalf of the Crae team, we'd also like to quickly shout out to our fabulous director, Anna Remington, who is currently watching this event while on maternity leave. So Anna, we hope you enjoyed attending tonight as an attendee, and we really, really hope that we've done you proud. A huge thank you to the Pears Foundation for their ongoing and extremely generous support. And a massive thank you to each and every one of you who's joined us tonight. Take a look at our website, crae.ioe.ac.uk, for details of future lectures and webinars that feature a host of really wonderful researchers and advocates. But otherwise, thank you again, Sue. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Crae. Thank you, Anna.